social justice, critical race theory, that kind of thing, and how we process that from a Christian perspective. What does that look like, and how do we then also like interact with other people that disagree with us in that arena? In my view of how Christians have handled that recently is very bad. So coming from an area of just like, no matter what you believe, like you can have an opinion. Everybody's entitled to an opinion. You can have an opinion, and I'm fine with that. But how we interact with those opinions is another thing. And so being good at saying, okay, like I have this opinion or you have that opinion, and like we've said all along, like I love you because you love, especially if you love Jesus, like we connect that piece together. But then how do we interact with one another? And too often things have blown up over things that are political in an unnecessary way, even between people that would both claim to know Jesus. So I think especially in this realm, it's difficult. So I want to talk through that a little bit today. And I want you guys to feel free to kind of share some of where you're at. I think we all have, again, we all have opinions. We all have thought processes as we see this. And so I would invite you to kind of share and process together. Like I said in the very beginning of this class, like safe space, right? We can process together, make sure that we can share what we think and how we're thinking through that and learn from each other in that. There is. Yeah. The follow-along stuff is on the website. If you go to the Equip class follow-along, which I think is the last tab on the homepage at mygracefamily.church, I have everything loaded up there for you. So here's where I thought we'd start. And I did have a hard time today as I was thinking about this. I was like, where do we start? Like, there's so many different angles we could go at this from. But here's where I started. I just asked the question, how has America seen race? And then there were two phrases that I think come up sometimes when we're thinking about what the interaction with race is. This is a phrase that's been used throughout American history, a cultural melting pot. Have you guys heard that phrase, that America is a melting pot? Okay. And then there's also this desire to be colorblind. So let's just start with the first one. When we think about the phrase, hi Anna, what are you doing? Hang on, let me kick my daughter out. Can you go find mom? Please? Can you go find her again? No. Okay, then you have to be quiet. Yeah. Okay, so when you hear the phrase cultural melting pot, when that has been used, what does that mean, or what does that idea bring up in your brain? Good.
I mean, I think it's supposed to mean like America is all these different cultures put together, but I think when we really look at it, I mean, and sometimes that is true, like people immigrated here and it's a whole big mix, but I don't know if we really, some people, I don't know if it's really true though, that everyone's like mixed together and everyone's all like one big American culture that comes from all these others. I think there's people hold different cultural beliefs still. Yeah, like we're not mixed together fully. It's like there's a chunk of this and a chunk of that and a chunk of this. They're not melting.
Yeah.
They're not melting.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes, we're still very
There's no melting. Yeah.
There's pot.
There you go. Yeah.
People are not pot
Okay.
together. I don't know if they're melting together.
There you go. Well, there's an alternative phrase to this that we'll talk about a little bit. What about the idea of colorblind? What does that mean?
You know, I think I've heard this before, you know, we need to be colorblind, we need to see this person who, you know, they're not African American, they're not Asian, they're not Latino, we're all, you know, just be blind to all colors so we can treat everybody the same. And that's a great thought. Let's all treat everyone the same. But people of color don't like that very much because I am a person of color. I have my own cultural ideas and my own, you know, like I'm unique. And when you say everyone's the same, we just need to be colorblind, you're basically trying to erase everyone's uniqueness of their color and culture and things like that. At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
I think it's an easy thing for like white people to say.
So white,
honestly,
like white conversation, yes.
Like just everyone's the same, but really I think that means like just be like us, or you know, be like how we want you to be. But it erases people's experiences
Mm-hmm.
history. So.
Yeah.
But I grew up on that phrase. Like, that was
Yeah.
like what they taught you in the 90s. Like, just do this and everything will be great. I think we're learning that is not true. It did
Yeah.
not work out well. So.
Yeah. So, like, overall, do you think those two ideas are helpful or not helpful? Okay. Why do you think they were things that we, as a culture, maybe leaned into then?
I think you're right, though. I think it's been a more of a white privilege.
Sure.
That's just, I don't hear people of color saying things like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you only have the dominant culture saying we need to do that,
Mhm.
then I think you're forgetting to make the other cultures feel just as, I don't know, not so,
Relevant.
you know, valid.
Yeah, valid or relevant. Yeah. Yep.
Validate
Yeah.
their experiences,
Yep.
and what culture is like for them in America. It's not the same as mine.
Right. Yep. Yeah. There.
Celebrate them. In other words, we should be celebrating that instead of saying, I'm going to ignore it and just be blind to it.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, I think what you guys said is super relevant. One of the things that has been true, like as you think about the idea of a melting pot, is all then the now you said too, like some of it hasn't melted together, but when things melt together, you lose those individual flavors that are there, right? So then kind of the idea is, well, when you come here, lose your individuality maybe and become what's already here. So that way, it's for lack of a better term, right, in the analogy, the flavor of what's happening just all kind of meshes together instead of there being different flavors represented. And one of the things that I've heard that's helpful is some people will say a cultural salad. Well, what happens with salad that doesn't happen with a melting pot or doesn't happen with a stew? You still have all those individual pieces, right? So I worked at Red Robin for like about 30 seconds because I shouldn't work at a restaurant. And I remember I had to make a Cobb salad. That was something that I had to, and then what was that? It was like I don't remember what was in it now, but like all the things that are in the Cobb salad, they're separated, right? It was a lot of stuff I didn't want to eat. So then all of it's together, but and people would mix it together, but there's a difference there. So even when a salad is mixed together, you can easily pull out a carrot or pull out some lettuce or tomato or whatever you've got in there. And so sometimes that's been a little bit more helpful. And that idea to be colorblind, I think you guys did a good job of, that's what that melting pot again, right? We don't necessarily see that. And sometimes, I think you guys pointed out well, sometimes that's hurtful to other cultures when they come here. Because it is a desire, it seems like a desire that we're saying to them, we want you to stop being you and be us. And currently and in the past, the overwhelming culture was led from a white perspective. And so that's what we wanted you to become. And if you didn't, then that was a frustration. That caused some tension and things like that. So I think it's important to think through those ideas and what they mean, especially when we come out of, you guys are saying you were taught that as a kid. I was taught that as a kid as well. So let's change the question a little bit. If you've been in a situation where race is talked about in church, what has been the message? Well, let me back up a little bit. How many of you have been in a situation where race has been talked about in a church environment? Has anyone ever been in a church where race is talked about in church environment? Okay. So, have you?
There was one
Maybe.
sermon, and I think he sort of missed the mark on it.
Okay, there you go.
One bad sermon.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So, what has been the message? Like when race was brought up in a church setting? So you guys both said they weren't great. You don't need to give the whole sermon, but like.
Yeah. He was just addressing diversity, and
Okay.
we did have people from like other white nations in our country, in our congregation. So like Australia, England. He was like, well, that makes us diverse. And it's like, well,
Okay. Yeah.
but also no, like,
Those cultures are very similar.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, and given the context of where our church was, like, our church should have probably looked a lot more diverse racially,
Okay.
given if you looked at the demographics of the town.
Yeah,
So to say that we're
sure.
a diverse church because there's other white people from other countries here, it's like, oh.
Yep. Yep.
It wasn't, so what I picked up on once was, this was maybe a year ago, so in the middle of all the racial
Mhm.
stuff, a black speaker came to a predominantly white church and just talked about, yeah, it was sort of like a rags to riches story, but just
Okay.
like all the stuff he overcame and like,
Yeah.
and I don't know, for me, it was like, yes, that can happen. It's just sort of, for me,
Yeah.
I was like, I think the takeaway for most white people there is that, see, like, the American dream applies equally to everyone.
Mhm.
Even though, right.
Yeah.
And so that this guy can do it, everyone can equally.
Sure.
To me, that's usually the takeaway that white people would take from that type
Yeah.
of message, and that's really not what they're saying, but
Yeah. Yeah.
find the example that fits your narrative and makes you
Yeah.
comfortable and stick with that
Yeah.
versus.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, so like here, I did a little bit, this was like last January when we did the, no, that's okay. You don't have to do that. That's okay. I knew you were saying, yeah. Nope, I have to go back and do that one again. But that too, there was a series that we did last January that was called In the Image of God, or the Imago Dei. And so within that, yes. And so within that, we did have some conversations, but the whole conversation was not just about race or whatever, but it was seeing everybody as an image bearer. That was the goal. And in some instances, it led to some conversation about race. And so it's hard, like, just so you know, from like even a church perspective, to not want to, like, I love this setting. Like, I wish there was more people having this conversation with us, right? What's difficult is, as a church, when you go, we're going to talk about race this Sunday, all of a sudden it's like, okay, like, what's the motive for just saying, okay, this Sunday it's going to happen, and then another Sunday it doesn't? I'm much more the person that would love for it to come out just like as we get to passages of Scripture where it's talked about and done, like, let's have that conversation. Yeah, right. It's not and it's not a, we put out the invitation and we're like, we're going to talk about race. You should come to church this Sunday. You know what I mean? Like, I don't like to use it as a draw necessarily either. You know what I mean? Like, we'll do that with Easter, but we're not going to do that with. So just having those, having these conversations, I think, is important. What about these difficult topics? Ever heard anybody talk about these in church setting? Black Lives Matter, defund the police, or critical race theory? Any of those things ever come up in church?
Not in church setting.
Yeah, probably not. That's why I was just
But don't
playing
you
with it.
think they should? No. I
Yeah.
mean, not all of these topics
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, sure.
So, but
Yeah.
I mean, I think where people are looking, Christians are looking for other Christians to give them some guidance sometimes, and then they find the loudest voice in the room, which sometimes is not great. And
Yeah.
then they're like, well, that's a Christian that said it. I'm not hearing it on Sundays, or I'm not hearing it in my small group. So.
Yep. Yeah.
And this isn't about you.
No, it's fine. Keep going.
Just in general.
You will not offend me.
You
Keep
know,
going.
like, why didn't churches talk about, decide, hey, this big thing just happened that involves race in our country. Maybe we need to stop and talk about this on Sunday as a church,
Yeah.
as a family.
I think Tim gave a sermon about Black
Good.
Lives Matter.
Did he? Good.
Yeah,
It was soon after you guys started, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Out in the parking lot, maybe?
yes. And
Yeah.
it was one of the reasons, it was impressive to me to hear anybody, any church even trying to tackle a subject like that.
Yeah.
I've had those conversations of all those things with other Christians, but not in a, particularly like in a sermon.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things too in this church is, I think Tim and you too, like even when the presidential vote was coming up, he was specifically saying, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you who to vote for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, like, I'm
Not going to.
Australian. I don't even
Yes.
know. Where I had other churches saying, if you're a Christian, you must vote this way.
Yeah, I'm not gonna do
like, what?
Yeah.
But, so that's why sometimes I'm not sure, like, if these are type political,
Yeah.
if they have a political agenda,
Yeah.
agenda with these, why it wouldn't come up in
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard because it's also a, how do I say this? Cultural topics are difficult because they're not necessarily driven from scripture. So it's hard sometimes to go, okay, well, this topic. So let's just say this is probably going to happen. So let's just say Pennsylvania legalizes weed, right? Let's just say that happens. Should I then preach on what to do with weed? I could, but am I going to be able to go to a place in scripture and go, this is exactly what the Bible says about that? Not necessarily. So it's hard to find the right angle of like, this is how we should lean into scripture and understand this topic, without also then feeding into the narrative of this is now all my pastor cares about. Because that can also be, as soon as a cultural topic comes out and the pastor comes out and goes, we're going to change and shift. Like I've told you, we have this whole year planned out for sermons already. So something more important shows up and I have to change it. I'm going to do that. But at the same time, I switch gears and now all of a sudden is that what's driving our politics, what's driving what we're talking about on Sundays? Well, no, it's not going to. But how do we make sure that we do evaluate and have those conversations about those things? It's this balance of like figuring out how do we, and this is why I want to create more spaces like this, where we go, like I did say when you signed up for this, like we were going to talk about this, right? So if you're interested in the conversation, you're here. Now some people just weren't able to be here today, but like there's that piece of like, would you want to know what we're having the conversation about? Come. Are we necessarily going to be able to do that on a Sunday morning all the time? Not necessarily. If it comes up, sure. And so yeah, it's a balancing match of like, figuring out, like I'll tell you guys a secret in the room. I'm just going to turn this. There was someone who, when I came here, they voted against me because of my political posts that I had. Now, I don't think there was any, I don't know who that person was. I don't think there was anything I posted that was like really what got there, right? Like it wasn't, but at the same time, it didn't fit a certain narrative. So that also, now that was one person. But at the same time, when you think about that as a pastor, it's like, okay, so like I need to make sure that I'm being true to scripture, absolutely. But you do think about in the back of your mind, like, what's that going to do to scripture? But so yeah, just processing that. But I'm always open to it. I want to have conversations about it, and that's why we're having the conversation now. So let's start here. Let's start with what is critical race theory. This is the one that I think most Christians have struggles with, kind of figuring out what do I do with it. So here's what I did. I took a definition that's from UCLA Alaskan School of Public Affairs. So this is a definition that's used for critical race theory that is used in critiques of it. It's used in for people that affirm it. So let's just see what this says, and then you guys can react to it. So it says this. Critical race theory recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society. The individual racists need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. This is the analytical lens that CRT uses in examining existing power structures. CRT identifies that though these power structures are based on white privilege and with supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. So when you read that, what's your immediate like feeling?
Yeah.
Okay.
True. I mean, I'm teaching To Kill a Mockingbird right now.
Okay. Yeah.
And before we started, I did this whole like background information, not on just lynchings of 1930s,
Yeah.
of racism.
Yeah.
I went back to the beginning of America and talked about the marginalization of people of color and the institutionalized systemic racism that has been pervasive in our country. And I thought, I'm going to be fired. I'm telling you, if these students go back and tell this kid, I didn't call it CRT.
Yeah.
Thank the Lord.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
My head of school would have fired me on the spot.
Yeah.
I just gave, and I didn't do it with any passion. I did it with facts
Yeah.
and stories that were true. Just going on true facts.
Yeah.
Just wanting them to understand the background of this book.
Yeah.
And then moving forward to today's lynchings, which are now more like following you in a truck and shooting you down.
Yes,
Like
right,
How has
right.
it improved any? Are we still
Right.
in the same spot?
Right.
And I love this unit, but I told Daniel about what I was talking about, and he's like, that's CRT, don't you? I'm like, what?
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like, no, I'm just was
Yeah.
talking about systemic racism in our country. He's like,
Yeah.
that's CRT. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm gonna get so fired. That
Yeah.
shows you how I literally, as I'm reading this is the
Yeah,
first time
sure.
I like read the, he told me it was, and I'm
Yeah.
like, maybe it is, but now that I see
Yeah.
this, I think it was.
Yeah.
But I didn't call it that.
Yeah, and that's okay. Yeah, here's the thing to understand, right? Critical race.
Christian school.
Yeah,
That's why I picked
Christian
it.
school.
I thought I might get fired.
So critical race theory as a whole is something that is used at the judicial, like, lawmaking level. So when they're looking at new laws and processing old laws and figuring that out, this is the lens through which they look through. So it was brought in as an idea of, let's make sure that the laws that are continuing to be made are not made with the same biases that were made previously when laws were made against people of color. Okay. So when people say critical race theory, sometimes the issue that you get is, like, what Daniel said is true. People hear that and they go, oh, then we can't teach it. But really, it's a framework of how do we process what happened before and make sure we don't go back there. Now, there'd be plenty of people who are Christians that go, that's not true what you just said, but I think it is true. So when we think about it that way, it's different than just, like, what you're teaching is truth. It's just truth, right? And it would be that what you're teaching would be something that would support some of what critical race theory says. Okay, so without getting into that
Right.
anymore.
I'm not talking about laws.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
anything
sure,
like
right.
that. I'm just talking about how it's been.
Right.
How this book is.
Right.
And have we improved?
Right.
Or are we going in the right direction?
Right, absolutely. And that's exactly, that's some of, I shouldn't say exactly, that's some of the big piece that critical race theory is trying to address. Let me say it that
I
way.
want to say one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
quickly. I do admissions at my school.
Yeah.
Too. And I have had more people enrolling at my school
Mhm.
to get away from critical race theory
Hmm.
from the public school for their kindergarten.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I know, that's the thing. It's not, keep going.
and so.
Yeah, yeah.
They come in and I'm admissions, so like, first I gotta ask you one question, right?
Yeah.
Do you teach CRT?
Yeah,
No, ma'am.
Yeah.
No, we don't teach that.
yeah.
Okay, good. Then I'm willing to like look.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I know,
We
but
don't, but I, no,
it's
just
kind
kidding.
of funny because
Yeah.
I have to like figure them out like within the first 2 minutes of the tour, like
Yeah.
CRT, and political stuff,
Yep.
and mass, like
Yeah, yeah,
vaccination
sure.
status, and I've got to figure out which way, because if I say something wrong,
Yeah,
they're going to be offended.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to figure them out, like,
Yep.
there's just now, used to be like, do you just want to come to our school? Now
Yeah.
it's like 15 things I got to figure out in the first 2 minutes
Yeah.
before I offend somebody.
yep,
And CRT is a huge one.
Right.
I didn't even know what it meant. I just like, no,
yeah. Yeah, and you don't teach it from, but see, here's the issue.
because we're not a law school.
Some people, right, that's the thing. So some people are like, yeah, do you teach it? Well, no. Do we, and this will get down to where I'm at later, but, like, do we teach historically the way things were and have been? Yes. And so sometimes that gets lumped into, yeah, it is. It's a catch-all. And to be clear, too, on both sides, so I've done some reading on this and done some research into the back end of what's going on. Those who hold to critical race theory are trying to pull more things into what critical race theory means. The opposite is happening for people that are against it. So they're also trying to make critical race theory mean something it doesn't mean. And so there's almost this tug of war going over the term CRT. And what that's making it even more unclear for people, because people are hijacking the term and going in some other way, like Daniel says, oh, that's critical race theory. Well, someone that, and Daniel's probably fine with that, but someone who's not fine with that is going to go, that's critical race theory. And like, really, it's not. But it is, because some people have defined it as that. So this tug of war is making things even more difficult for people to understand. So that's what critical race theory is. That's how it's defined and how it's being kind of pulled and tugged. Now, here's a question, right? What does Scripture say about it? Now, this is another area we go, well, critical race theory is not in the Bible. Like, how do we process that? But there are three areas I think we can look at specifically that help us process what's going on and why we would look at the world, and maybe include some of CRT into a lens through which we see things. Let me tell you what I mean. So, Joshua 7. Joshua 7 is the story of Achan. Anyone remember the story of Achan and what happened with him?
I just remember he was aching somewhere toward the end of that story, wasn't he?
He was what?
Aching.
Oh, I don't know.
Did he die?
He did die. Yes. He took...
His whole family died.
Correct. So here's what happens, right? He steals things when they're not supposed to, buries them under the tent. And they come forward and they go, hey, who stole it, right? And they're all like, we didn't steal it, we didn't steal it, we didn't steal it. And then at the end, when they figure it out, because God just shows who did it, right? They find all the stuff. Achan dies and like his whole family. So people read that story and they go, well, that's not fair. What Achan stole it. His kids had nothing to do with it. So why did they die if Achan was the one who brought this up? Now, I'll be honest, right? This information comes from Tim Keller. So Tim Keller did a talk on this. I found it on YouTube. I thought it was brilliant. So he laid all this out even better than I would. But one of the things he said was, I found this very interesting. He said, in America and in the West, we have a very individualist, I can't say. There it is. Okay. Talking today, hard. We have that perspective of when people do things that are wrong. So if you do something wrong, it's just your choice and no one got you there. In other cultures, people would say, well, that person did something wrong because their parents didn't do the right thing by them. Now, sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not, right? But this is why the disciples look at Jesus one time and they go, is this guy blind because he sinned or because his parents sinned, right? So there was this idea of if you did something, it was because somebody else. So when something like this happened, we look at this and go, well, that's terrible that God would kill innocent people. Now, here's the first thing, right? You don't just come into a tent and bury a bunch of stuff without the rest of the people in the tent understanding what's going on. So we would think about that and go, oh, Dad just put it in the garage and no one else knew about it. That's probably not the way it worked in a tent back then, okay? So did the rest of the family know what was going on? Could they have spoken up and said, we have it, Dad stole it, right? Probably. But what they understood was there was a framework here where Achan had been led or allowed to think through a process where he was going to do this thing, and then the rest of the family came around and hid it too. So there was a need for justice to happen, not just for him, but for his family. So how does that apply to critical race theory? Well, sometimes what people will say, right, is, well, somebody else did it, it's not me, right? My ancestors did this or somebody else did it. I had nothing to do with it, so I have no skin in the game. Right, I'm not culpable for it. Even if you're not culpable for it, is it possible that the culture has created a system where this wrongdoing was allowed? That's what's happening with Achan. And so God's punishment was to say there was a culture that allowed this to happen. Therefore, more people were culpable, good word, than just Achan. And so there is an idea where if our culture, if our systems have allowed these bad things to happen, even though we don't necessarily do it specifically ourselves, if we've allowed it to happen or created a system where it was encouraged to happen even, that's a problem. And so there is culpability for others depending on what's going on in that culture. I'll give you an example. And this is kind of a big example, but I've talked through this with a couple of different guys, and I think it's important. So in the George Floyd case, right? So he's killed, and what happens with that, right? There's all this fallout and processing, and people on both sides are, some people would say that's terrible, he was murdered. Some people still say it didn't count or something. I don't know. People have weird opinions. But I've talked with two different police officers about this, and I said to one, that should not happen, right, where he's got his knee on his neck. He goes, no, absolutely not. No one teaches you that. If you're doing that, you're inflicting unnecessary damage to somebody you don't need to have. Okay, so first of all, there was that. So there was a culture that taught that police officer that was okay. Here's the second piece. I talked to another police officer recently about it because one of the things I read in the trial was that there was, I think, 3 or 4 officers there that day. The one officer that had his knee on Floyd, the other guys around had just been led by him. Like they had just been trained by him in what they were doing. And one of the things I read was in police culture, when you are trained by a officer that's older than you and he's telling you what to do, he's God. Like you do what he says. And if you don't, then you're going to get pushed backwards in the order and you're not going to get to be a police officer as quickly. So I said to my friend who used to be a cop and is now a pastor, I said, is that true? He goes, yeah. He goes, those guys never would have even had the thought that they could even say anything to him. Now, he didn't say that was right. He said that's wrong. That's a problem. But he said that's the culture that was created in that situation. So that's just an example of, yes, what he did himself was wrong, but there's also a culture there that is a problem, that created a space. They were arrested and held, and so my friend that's a pastor he would say, yeah, they should have said something, right? They should have done what they knew was right. But he's saying in the culture that policing has sometimes, he goes, they would have, even if they thought it, they would have gone, this guy, I can't say anything. This guy's the guy I'm supposed to answer to. So again, just an unhealthy culture. So yeah, they did. They got arrested and they're in jail. I don't think maybe their trial didn't happen yet, but they did get arrested. So that's one. Daniel chapter 9 is very interesting. If you read his prayer, Daniel talks about and prays about the lament that he has that his ancestors did not follow God and did not follow the prophets that were given to them. So when some people would say, again, it was my ancestors that did it, right? I'm not responsible for the things my ancestors did. No. But there is examples in Scripture where people are lamenting what their ancestors did, and there is a feeling of remorse for what had happened. So while, again, we're not necessarily the ones who had slaves, right? Our ancestors maybe did. When we just simply go, okay, well, those were my ancestors. I have no skin in this. Just leave me alone. Those were my ancestors. I didn't do anything. That also does not show this desire to feel what the other people are feeling for their ancestors, right? And there's no desire to love them and care for them, knowing that what our ancestors did was not right. And go ahead.
Oh, and I think another piece too is how we benefit.
Yeah, right.
From those things that happen. Like,
Yep.
I think that's a key issue. There is people benefit differently from what happened, and so whether you're.
Yep.
So, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. Jump in whenever. So yeah, I think that was a very interesting verse to me because I've heard that said, like it was my ancestors. Okay, but then how much am I supposed to think about what my ancestors did and lament it because I know that it wasn't right? And if Daniel's doing that, that gives an example of he was feeling that remorse and there was some empathy there for what was going on. I think that's important. This one's also interesting, right? So in Romans 5, because of Adam's sin, we're all guilty. So that doesn't automatically mean that we're all racist because our ancestors were racist. But that connection of sin to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation can be felt and can be there. And I think even in, I've seen in families where addiction is a problem, right? It gets handed down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. Sin does flow that way.
Wouldn't you see that?
Yeah.
Too? Like, I was thinking about some people are racists purely because their daddy, granddaddy, great-granddaddy were in the Ku Klux Klan
Yeah.
going back 100 years.
Yeah.
And it's just passed down from generation.
Yeah.
That hate
Yeah.
is passed down. And it's not that I'm not saying that they're still culpable.
Yeah,
just
right,
like
sure.
They're still responsible for
Yep.
their actions. But it's so ingrained in them from many generations of teaching that.
Yeah.
Like shows you how much influence we can have in our children.
Yeah.
For love or hate.
Right.
Because they grow up
So
from
we teach
little
'em.
that way. They don't think much. It's very hard to break those cycles of
Yeah.
addiction or hate or any of those things.
Yep.
I was reading an interesting book that's sort of related to that, but, on the sort of the black side as well, like on the receiving end of that, how generationally it's talking about the massive disparities in health, life expectancy. I mean, you name it, people on the losing end of every health metric you can name, and just how, that can be just passed on too, just as you're,
Passed on by like genes or just like
yeah, stress, just like, maybe.
also not going
but
to
just-
distrust of doctors.
Yeah.
Has been
Yeah,
a big
it's true.
The stress
Yeah.
of the system that you've lived in.
Yeah.
You're-
Early on, even like, if you say the Native American cultures and stuff like fried ribs, food that's
Yeah.
introduced by the government to nourish these people, but it's saturated fat and
Yeah. Yep.
like there's
Yeah.
Like it wasn't just an accident.
Yeah, it wasn't an accident. Yeah. 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 So yeah, I think there are some biblical themes that also flow into when we call it CRT. Well, I'll say something specifically about that later, in case anybody listening is really worried about the fact that I'm okay with CRT. There are biblical themes that kind of go like this with that perspective when we come from the right way. And so I don't think it's so easy just to write off and say, well, we're not responsible for what our ancestors did. We have no culpability there. We just need to get over it and move on. There's a video I'll probably link to when I send you guys the notes, but there's a guy named this isn't his real name, but his stage name is Propaganda. He's a Christian guy. He raps and does spoken word stuff, but he also speaks out a lot on this stuff. And in the video, he said, listen, when 9/11 happened, and even to this day, right, you might go some places in the country, and it'll be a poster of 9/11 or something, and it'll say, never forget, right? But he goes, that's your guy. He goes, I'm an American. I feel that trauma, but that's trauma that a lot of white people can identify with. He goes, my trauma, you just want to say, get rid of it and don't remember it. And he goes, that's a problem, right? Because I'm an American too, so I feel this trauma, never forget 9/11. Okay, but let's talk about this trauma over here. And everybody just goes, no, we don't remember that one. And I think that's a real picture of we just kind of erase the trauma we don't want. Even though I think there are biblical themes that say we should be thinking through what our culture is doing, what our ancestors did, and how we move forward from there. Keller had a super good quote, and I put it here in the notes. It says, if I am responsible for only what I have done, then there is no gospel. I was like, you could just stop talking right there, and that's all you have to say. It was so good. I'll link to that talk too, because I think that was really good. Any thoughts on that before I keep going a little bit?
I've heard another thing about, maybe, no, you didn't do something that previous generations did, but it's still on you to recognize the way things still aren't right.
Correct.
So, if you're continuing to perpetuate that, then
Yes,
on you.
absolutely. Yeah, then you are culpable for that. I did name just 3 issues that Christians have with CRT. These largely come from a book called Fault Lines. There's a guy named Vadi Bach. I can't remember. Vodi Bacham, however you say it. Yeah, I can't remember. So I read it. I would say I agree with 25% of what's in there, just being honest. But these are the arguments that he would make. The first thing is that equality as a goal is not biblical, reasonable, or achievable. And he would say this is true because if you look at Matthew chapter 25, where there's the parable of the talents, God does not give the same amount to each person. So he says that equality isn't necessarily biblical. Now, I would argue back and go, okay, so if I preach Matthew chapter 25 and I stand up here and say, God has clearly given more favor to white people, so we have more responsibility, black people have less favor, no, all of you should get up and walk out of church. If that's the way I preach that passage, right? Just go. So I have a real issue with that. I do see how he's saying that, yeah, some people are given, but in that passage, it's not talking about just the general public. He's talking about in the kingdom of heaven. So when we think about equality of giving people and wanting people to have value, that's a very different conversation than God gifting people with certain things and also saying to whom much is given, much is required, right? I don't think that God's not doing that with different races. He does that in our giftings within the spirit of what we're responsible for when it comes to building the kingdom of heaven. And those that are given more then are also held to a much higher standard and are judged more so for what they did. And so that's one conversation. So I think that's easy to kind of come back on. 2, people today should feel no shame for the sins of their ancestors. We talked about that. This one's hard. Number 3, black people have not seen or experienced anything that white people can't understand. Right, I know, right? I don't get there. This is my best example of how this isn't true. If I looked at my wife in labor and was like, oh, I totally understand what you're going through, she would have hit me, right? And probably harder than any other time in history. Yeah, something bad would have happened. I don't see, I have a hard time with that too. So I'm really putting my cards on the table. But yeah, those are 3 arguments that would come back, and I struggle with all 3 of them. But yeah, struggle is probably a nice word.
The first
Yeah.
one, going back to.
Sure, go ahead.
The quality as a goal, to me, I don't my understanding of CRT is that's not a goal. My understanding is like CRT came out of like the eighties when after 20 years of the civil rights, people were looking at the laws and be like, wait, there's still massive disparities here. We haven't achieved
Yeah,
what we thought was going to be accomplished by the civil rights. Why? And then that's what CRT is.
yeah,
It's maybe equality, but equal justice.
exactly, right.
Law, but,
Yeah,
I mean, and yeah, like we mentioned before, yeah, I really like the podcast, Southside Rabbi.
okay, I haven't listened to it, but yeah, okay,
They're like really good. They did a really long sessions on this topic.
yeah,
And I forget where I was going with that, because they mentioned something, well, a lot of stuff.
yeah. I'll have to check that out.
But, just talk about how, yes, even CRT has been gentrified, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, everyone now is,
Yeah.
and yeah, nothing's a monolith, even CRT. You
Yeah.
have everyone else, you have the original of what it was in like the eighties.
Yeah.
It just sort of goes out, so yeah, it means a whole lot of things to
Yeah.
different people.
Yeah,
I was just gonna, I'm sorry, I'll give an example. I had a student, we were talking about this wasn't this year, it was another year, this racism in class. And he was a African-American young man, and he was sharing with the class about how his dad, when he got older, had to teach him what to do when he got pulled over. And how you have to, these are like 5, 6 things. You have to keep your hands on the wheel. You got to do this. You got to do. And the kids were like, "Why do you have to do that?" And he goes, "Because we want to live." And the white kids in the class were like astounded by that. They were like, they didn't understand. So the whole idea of that book is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So I'm like, so this is good for you to hear his perspective. I was sharing it among my colleagues during after-school professional development with like, isn't that cool? And one of the teachers in my little group said, he doesn't need that. He's probably lying about that. I'm like, what do you mean? He doesn't have to like do anything different when a cop pulls him over. I'm like, what? And he's like, he lives in Reading. How bad can it be? And then the other teacher agreed with him and said, maybe you should discipline him for lying. And I was like, what? Like literally, this was the conversation. And the funny thing is, professional development was about how to be better understanding of people with diversity. But anyway, that was what we were talking about. That's why I brought up the example. But that just shows you how ingrained it was in these two, I will say they were older teachers, that my experience is your experience, and your experience is mine. And I've lived in Reading a long time, and that's never happened to me, so it can't happen to you. And that's just what you're saying. It shocked me because I just didn't realize how prevalent, that third thing sounds crazy to us, the third one you just mentioned, but it's not crazy. There's people all over the place doing that.
Just in general, I think it's also important to like think about why are we even talking about CRT in the last 2 or 3 years? Like, it was a political tool, I would say, that someone threw out there to stir trouble. And now, I mean, I was a history teacher. I never learned about CRT in my training to be a history teacher.
Did you know we worked at the same school?
That wasn't even, yeah.
At the same school you worked at?
Yeah. But like, and I've taught in private schools, I've taught in public schools. Never has anyone come to me and said, teach this. I've taught history, the facts, and even history books are sometimes written not even factual. But, I mean, I think that's just an important thing to remember too. Why is this even a big deal now? And like, what does that mean? And like, how have we been manipulated to like turn on each other with this term that, it's a law term.
Yeah, right.
It's not, it's also a theory, so.
right. Yeah, it's a theory. Yeah, and I think that is where, in some cases, it is presented as fact, right? In all cases. And so the pushback then, so like just getting the last little bit of this, the big question everybody asks, right? Should CRT be taught in schools? People will ask that, right? You could ask that. The bigger question is, what does that mean? So like in the curriculum, what does that mean you're teaching? Okay, so does that mean that we're going to teach about racism, and we're going to talk about what it meant when the slaves got actually out of slavery, but then had to go back and be sharecroppers. And what does it mean for those? What is Juneteenth? I never learned anything about that. Like, what does that mean? And so it's not just like, yeah, we're not teaching, if they're not taking a law class, no, we're not teaching CRT. But what does it mean in the classroom should be the question. So I would even say that as, if parents are thinking about, oh, now someone at my school board meeting's mad because they're going to start teaching CRT in class. Okay, but what does that mean? You need to know exactly what that means. Now, let's say, I think there is a point where this goes too far, right? So there was a classroom, a 5th grade teacher, in a school that was just outside of Philly it was a few months ago. And it came out that what she did was she had 5th graders. She lined all the white kids up from all the black kids. And she made all the white kids apologize to the other kids because of the racism their ancestors had shown. Now, I think that maybe goes a step too far, because in 5th grade, you should be teaching them history at a level they can understand. But I think that was a little bit, so I think there's a sliding scale, right? What's right, what's wrong? Should we teach them the facts about history? Absolutely. And how does that actually play out? The issue with CRT, the big one that we have to be careful of, and this is where Christians can't necessarily jump in the CRT canoe all the time and just start paddling together, is that it does not recognize a creator or that humans were made in the image of God. So from that background, right, we have to be a little bit careful. And this is where I go, okay, let's maybe treat CRT the way we treat evolution at times. Are there pieces of it where we can go, absolutely, this is true, like we talked about with microevolution, and we saw how things progress and how God has created things? Absolutely. Are we going to go all the way to the side of macroevolution? Well, no, for the most part, because we're going to say that God created everything. And so I think that there's just it's like a timeline, and there's spaces where we have to find our space where we're comfortable being. But we can't just take the whole thing and throw it out, or take the whole thing and just say yes completely. There has to be some good thought process, and what critical thinking is the phrase I was looking for, as we process what that means, and really understanding when we get into schools and teaching our kids, what is actually being taught. Can we see the curriculum? By the way, you can always see the curriculum, and what's actually being taught to my kids.
If you substituted CRT with systemic racism,
Yeah.
it's completely different, or if would it be different for you to say?
I think it's pretty consistent.
It's pretty
That,
much the same.
yeah, because systemic racism isn't again, it's looking at things that have happened. It's not a theory that then guides what we're going to do in the future.
So it's more going backwards?
Yeah.
Going backwards.
Yeah, I mean, it could be present day as well. The goal would be to move forward without systemic racism, right? So, but yeah, you're looking at what's happening moving forward. So that's probably a safer term if you're going to go, do we teach CRT? No, but we do teach that systemic racism has happened. That's probably a different, a better way of saying it, I guess. But yeah, we all kind of have to come to our conclusions on that. Does that make sense?
I just think
Go ahead.
the problem now is that people don't think if you talk about anything with race,
Mhm.
in regards to history, you're teaching CRT.
Right, and yeah, that's a problem.
So it's like, I'm like, I don't know if I want to be a history teacher, because how would I, it just
Yeah.
feels like impossible to navigate that, coming from the other side, and as if we were teaching.
Yeah.
I'm like, most teachers I know aren't like, let's brainwash all our students,
Yeah.
if that were true, their kids would do their homework every night. Not top grade class.
You know what's interesting too is when I was teaching apologetics, I always had a section on racism before CRT was even a thing. So again, I'm teaching on racism in America. CRT was not even part of the conversation 3 years ago. And I had to put out all my stuff I was being taught. Now, I don't think parents really looked. But I think today, parents would be more likely to have a problem just because CRT has become something, right? So 3 years ago, when I'm going, look at what systemic racism was, and I'm teaching all the things we're going to walk through here in just a second, they were like, okay. And then all of a sudden it's CRT. It's like, wait, is that okay? You know what I mean? It's like almost now it's swung back the other direction of, no, now I'm worried to talk about those things because of what I've been told. So yeah, there's a lot there. That's where I say parents, just ask what they're teaching. Don't just assume that if they're saying CRT, they're actually teaching something you don't
And
like.
I don't understand, with all three of these subjects.
Yeah.
Why it seems so I just don't understand that. You know, like I have a pretty liberal child, and he would say, that's a Republican problem, those three things. They don't, like, and I'm like, no, because, I mean, I'm not gonna say one way or other
Sure.
where I land,
Sure.
but I'm saying, like, I can be this and still think this
Yeah.
is wrong,
No, you can't,
But-
Shannon.
But, but he would say, well, maybe not you, but.
Yeah.
And he's got a point,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
No, I
It's
get
like
it.
when you start to see the same people who lean that way,
Yep.
then bashing Black Lives Matter or defund the police,
Yep.
like,
Yep.
you see it over, I just don't understand why any of these subjects have become political fodder.
Yeah. Leveraging for votes.
History, it's staggering to me how much of this just is history repeated. And it's just, like, everything you're saying, Marxism, communism, socialism, like, all that stuff, that's what they said about Martin Luther King. Like, that's all the
Yeah.
stuff they said about, you're just repeating history.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a lot of work to do to, go through history again and learn.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
It helps put stuff in a little bit, in a bit of a perspective, but it's really heartbreaking to just see the Christian community around you that raised you a certain way, feel like it's abandoned all of it, and just to repeat history and
Yeah.
be on the wrong side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one area that I will say that gets some undue attention, I think, is the rate at which black men are killed by police. Sometimes that is a little bit more publicized by the media, and the ratios aren't as unequal as they seem to be at times. Now, does that still happen? Yes. Are black men still murdered by police? Yes. So are other people. And so that's not to say one is better than the other at all, but at the same time, I do want to be careful. Like with things like defund the police, it probably should just mean reallocate some funds for the police, but that doesn't hashtag as easily. So that's the problem, right? That's what happens. So I do, because one case would be the case of Breonna Taylor, right? When that first came out, it was they were at the wrong apartment and they no-knocked and they all this stuff and they were just laying in bed. That was all found to not be true. And so that's a hard one where you go, okay, like I want justice for this person, but what I was told at the beginning of this conversation was actually very false from what actually happened. Now, someone died. That's a tragedy. That we want that to happen in the least amount of time as possible, right? But the police got a bad rap for things they didn't actually do that were said they were done. So that's where in some of those cases we just have to go, okay, did I get all the information? Now, Ahmaud Arbery, that's not a cop. He was just killed in the street, right? That's blatant racism. That wasn't cops, though. So there's just times where we have to be careful about things like that, too, on the other side, and just kind of figure it out.
Can't throw it all into one big melting
Correct.
pot.
There you go. Bring it back all the way full circle. Correct.
It's case by case,
Yes.
too,
Right,
like-
absolutely.
Plus it's being informed.
Yes.
I just, since the last 2 years, I don't even take anything anybody puts on social media as face value anymore.
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't
Yep.
I don't like
That's a
it,
good
I don't
policy.
share it.
Yeah.
I research
Yep.
it first
Uh-huh.
before I even
Yeah.
would even comment on it, just
Yeah.
because you can't take anything anybody says
Yep.
is the truth or the
Yep.
accurate version.
Yeah. Now, I will say, I understand why the black community has such a problem with police officers, because it was, in the South, it was guys that were hired to go after runaway slaves that were the first law enforcement in the country. So when you look at it that way and you go, the first time we ever had to enforce laws was just to chase down slaves, that's problematic, right? The reason that police, even came in the first place was because of the Irish, but, we don't hear about that a lot. So, yeah. No, that's right. That's what I'm saying. All right, we're after 12:30, so let me keep going, and then we can talk about anything we want to talk about. So how has systemic racism been a part of America's past? There's other things, but sharecropping, quick overview, people got out of slavery. They had nowhere to go and nothing to do, so they had to survive somehow. So they end up going back and basically just working the same grounds they had been, and they got some money from it, but they were still basically in the same situation as slavery without being owned. Jim Crow laws were the dividing laws between, who can use what bathrooms and all of that kind of stuff. Redlining is when black people could only get houses and get home insurance in certain areas. They couldn't get them in other areas. Why is that a problem? well, it's a problem because it's racist. But then secondary, we're still seeing the fallout from that because owning property is one of the most efficient ways to build wealth in America. So when you're looking and you're going, you can't own a home or you can't get a home that's going to appreciate in value, we're going to set you behind. When white people are able to get the homes that are going to appreciate value, we've now literally on purpose by law slowed down their ability to gain wealth while white people were able to gain wealth they couldn't get. So that's a snowball, right? And so people would still say today, people have benefited from being able to buy those homes. Their ancestors were able to buy those homes. And then 3/5 compromise. Obviously, this was accounting for only counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, so that they could account better for when they would vote, like the yes census, but then electoral college too. Like that's how. Which again, let's go back to Baucham's book for a minute. This is frustrating. He used. Vadi Baucham, I can't ever say his name right. It was the book called Fault Lines. The argument that he presents in there was that this was not racist, and that if they had counted those people as actual people, and not 3/5 of a person, then elections would have gone the other way. So the South, more presidential people and people elected from the South would have gotten more elections won, and racist laws would have gone longer. But because they didn't count them as 3/5, they didn't count them as a full person, more people from the North won, which meant that those racist laws didn't happen as long as they did before. Again, very confusing. It doesn't justify what happened. But so anyway, those are all things that are, again, they're laws that were put in place to restrict the rights of black people, even though our Constitution states all men are created equal, right? By the way, I was having a conversation with Carl Edwards a couple weeks ago, and he told me this, that there are still deeds on homes today in New Holland that say they are not to be sold to black people. That's how old the deeds are, and they still say that today. So he said, like, when they had a whole conversation about this stuff about a year ago for their staff, he's like, when people say, well, that doesn't happen here anymore, that's whatever. He's like, well, you do a little digging, like, it's still there. This was the North, right? That's what.
Welsh Mountain area, there were a lot of residences that people were thrown out of. They just kind of lived there.
Yeah.
It was not within my lifetime, but
Right.
before.
Yeah.
They lived on that land as long as they can remember. Just see it.
Yep.
Someone bought it.
Yep. And this was also I'm going to name, there's a wrong name. Sunset. I can't remember. Sunset Town or something like that, where basically if you weren't out of town, if you were black and you weren't out of town, you could be lynched. So by the time the sun went down. So New Holland was one of those towns back in the day.
Can I say
Yeah, good. Yep.
This always blows my students away. We talk about lynching
Yeah.
quite a bit in this unit I'm doing, and there's been over 200 laws sent to Congress since like 1865 to make lynching a federal crime, and they've always been, denied.
Wow.
They never went through. Finally, it did go through that now lynching is considered a federal crime in 2018.
Wow. That's
Kids are
crazy.
like, what?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yep, it's
Yeah.
now a federal crime to lynch somebody
Huh.
in America, after like 200.
After all this time.
to get it to go.
Yeah.
It's just more,
It's paperwork. It's red tape. Yeah.
you know,
I'm 94% sure I'm right on this, but it's either the last lynching in the North or the last lynching in the continental United States happened in Coatesville. Yeah. Maybe it's in the North because there might have been more after, but it was like, yeah, really late 1800s, early 1900s. It happened in Coatesville. There's a spot like those like blue and yellow signs you go by on the road sometimes that mark like a historical location.
it's gotta be just
Yeah.
because they were lynching people all the way up. to
Yeah,
the
so that's got to be what it was. But maybe I'm wrong on the timeline. Anyway, Google that, but I remember just from being there. Okay, so while some CRT initiatives go too far, we talked about that, we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that we must address the inequality that has been a part of our country for too long. So how do we do that? I just came up with 3 things. Admit racial bias. So at times, we have things. I remember I had a racial bias when I was younger, and I thought it was a good thing. I thought black people were tougher than white people. Now, that's a racial bias, And I thought it was just like, well, they've been through way more than, like, my life's easier than you, so you're tougher than me. That was my rationale. It wasn't even, to me, it wasn't a negative thing in my mind. But it was just racial bias that I had. So we just have to be honest about that and then admit that. See the image of God in others, that's an obvious one. And then build diverse friendships and communities, so being able to have those conversations with people. I think this has some interesting places it could go for the church, because more than 50% of children under 5 are not white. So what does that mean for our church? And I think it's in America. I should have qualified that. When we think about that, it's hard, because I do think at one sense when we go, we want our church to be diverse. What does that mean? It should reflect our community. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I want our church to automatically be 50% black, 50% white. Like, that's not a realistic expectation for the community we're a part of. Now, I do wish there was more representation in our church family of the community that we live in. But what is it? That's the goal that we should be reaching for. But we have to, if we're going to continue having this fight, right, for the next 30 years when all of our kids are old enough, like, the fact that our churches are still so split is going to create even more problems, because there's more generations of other, from other countries and other cultures coming into our country than ever before. And so we just, processing that, helping our kids understand, which our kids tend to understand that until they're taught false things anyway. But just, encouraging our kids to be ready for that and be excited about it. Then the last question was just, how can we be advocates for racial reconciliation without approving of policies and practices that we might disagree with? So even when we do disagree with something someone might do, how do we make sure that the positive thing is still happening, or we make sure that we're still moving in the right direction? I think some of that is the tension. The opposite side of the aisle, where we are politically, is not always going to do the exact thing we want, even when we're on board with maybe what their desires are. And so it's just finding that way to be a influence that's good, that looks like Jesus in those moments, so that we don't do what we did in the past, right? We don't repeat that history, but we also don't do something that's not helpful. And we find that middle lane as much as we can to move forward in a positive direction, which I think is one of the most difficult things to do. So,
Really
yeah.
good to listen, because
Yeah.
I had lots of conversations with my kids who thought very differently than I did,
Yeah.
because I was just listening to the news or I wasn't really
Yeah.
researching it.
Yeah.
And then they kind of like nailed me, like, do you even know what this is?
Hmm.
I'm like, well, I think I do, and like, here I had formed an opinion
Yeah.
without even really knowing about it.
Right.
But having conversations where we respect one another,
Mhm.
we try to put ourselves in each other's shoes,
Yeah.
and we don't condemn the other for
Right.
their opinion.
Yep.
It was very helpful for me to grow as a person.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't in a argumentative way.
Yeah.
Antagonistic.
Right.
And if you can do that, if you can find someone with a different opinion than you and really listen,
Yeah.
you might find that some of their reasonings are pretty valid, and it might make you
Sure.
think. It just helps you grow as
Yeah.
a Christian and as a person, but also in your relationships with non-believers and believers,
Right.
to like have some, give their point of view some validity,
Yep.
even if you don't agree with it
Yeah.
in a godly way.
Yeah. And I found more often than not, when Christians immediately take something and demonize it immediately, right? I don't agree with it, or I think it's bad, or whatever. Immediately, like without actually digging into it, it almost always goes the wrong direction. Because we miss even the idea of being able to have a conversation with somebody about it. Like, okay, so what does that mean? Like the new movie Red, right, came out, and people are upset about that movie too. Like, okay, I get why there's things in there that would I want my 5-year-old to watch? And did I think about turning it off? Yeah. But did I watch it and go, I'm not holding Pixar to a standard that I would hold a Christian to? Yeah, that's different too. It's like, how do I then have a conversation about it? You know what I'm saying? Instead of just going, no, we're just not going to watch it. Like, okay, but let me dig in and let's have the conversation. Let's see what's going on. Like you said, here's somebody else's opposite perspective, and actually walk through it and, again, think critically. That's an important piece that we miss sometimes, and that's problematic. But, yeah. Well, a couple of resources I'll send through. I will send through a link to Vadi's book if you want to read it. I think it's a really good book to read to understand that side of the conversation. Like, now I at least feel like even if somebody says something I disagree with, I'm prepared for that conversation from an educated point of view, because his book is kind of taken, especially in Reformed evangelical circles, as the book on why we don't like CRT. So I'll link to that. A book that I really appreciate on it by a guy I really like is called Woke Church by Eric Mason. Eric Mason is a pastor in Philadelphia. He runs a church called Epiphany, he leads a church called Epiphany, which is the most diverse congregation I have ever been a part of in my life. I didn't go to church there, but I visited there once or twice. Oh, it's so cool. You should just go. You have my permission. Just go on a Sunday.
All of us. all
It's
together
insane.
on a
Just all
Sunday,
go.
dude.
Sounds good to me. But yeah, I mean, like, seriously, Amish people were there in the middle of Philadelphia and every other culture you can think of. And so he's fantastic. He's a biblical mind. I trust him. So that's Woke Church. So that's another one. And then I have a couple videos. I'll send you the link to the Keller video I pulled some of this stuff from, and some of the propaganda videos. Propaganda of the person, not propaganda of the thing. Yeah, I was like, he goes by prop a lot, which makes sense because, yeah, anyway. So, but yeah, just good stuff that I've found over the years, just kind of processing. I'm sure you guys have other ones too. So feel free to share back in like the text or the email thread if you want to. But it's a long conversation that I don't think is
Was this
going away.
recorded?
Yeah,
So
we record them all.
who listens to those?
We didn't put them out yet.
So our comments will be,
All your students, parents.
like, just you?
I don't think, if you're uncomfortable, I'll listen back through and make sure that it's not. That's why when I,
Name of my school.
Timnor said.
oh yeah, you didn't say the name of your
No,
school.
but
You didn't.
mentioned Daniel.
That's true.
Figure it out. No,
Anyway,
it's okay.
that's why when I was going to tell you my little secret, I turned off the microphone.
Yes, yeah.
Because I don't think it picks up as enough to be able to
But
hear.
I don't have a problem with it because I think what you're saying is so important.
Yeah.
That my few little muted comments is not gonna make a big deal.
Yeah.
We can always go in and fill it in with the peanuts, like, wah, 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 wah.
Yeah, there you go.
Once you are a teacher, it fit perfect.
I can easily drop the audio. But yeah, we'll figure out. But that I think this is really the only
Then that's,
thing that's picking up. I don't think it'll pick you up very well. But
you said it was
Yeah.
a safe place. I was
yeah. No, yeah, that was my plan, was to not have everybody